Kingston exhaled deeply as he stepped out of his moving truck, stretching his sore muscles. This was it, his dream home. After years of hard work and dedication, he finally had a place he could call his own. The house, a sleek two-story modern build, sat proudly on a quiet suburban street. The manicured lawns, pristine sidewalks, and luxury cars parked in driveways signaled that this was the kind of neighborhood where people took pride in their homes. Kingston smiled, imagining cookouts in the backyard, peaceful evenings on the porch, and the sense of accomplishment that came with homeownership. But before he could fully soak it in, a sharp voice cut through the warm afternoon air. "Excuse me. What are you doing?" Kingston turned, his hands still gripping a box of books. A middle-aged woman with stiff blonde hair and a pinched expression marched toward him. She wore a pastel cardigan draped over her shoulders and had the unmistakable air of someone who believed the world revolved around her. Moving in," Kingston replied casually, setting the box down on the porch. Leslie's eyes narrowed. She glanced at the house, then back at Kingston, her lips pursed as if she had just bitten into a lemon. "No, I don't think so. The people who actually live here wouldn't." She stopped, sizing him up. "You're breaking in, aren't you?" Kingston let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Nope. Bought this place last month." He reached into his back pocket, pulling out his keys and jingling them. "See?" Leslie didn't budge. "I don't believe you." Kingston sighed, already feeling the headache creeping in. "Believe what you want, lady. I'm not about to argue with you on my own front porch." But Leslie wasn't done. She pulled out her phone with practiced ease, as if she had done this before. "I'm calling the police. We'll see who really owns this house." Kingston rubbed his temples. "Go ahead. I'll wait." Minutes later, 2 squad cars pulled up. The officers stepped out cautiously, hands resting near their holsters. Kingston had been here before. He knew how this looked. A black man standing outside a luxury home, a distressed white woman pointing fingers. "Sir, step away from the house," one officer commanded. Kingston raised his hands slowly. "This is my house," he said calmly. "I have the deed inside if you'd like to see it." One officer went to verify while the other kept his eyes locked on Kingston. Meanwhile, Leslie stood smugly to the side, arms crossed. She was enjoying this. When the first officer returned, he looked visibly irritated. "Ma'am, this man owns the property. His name is on the deed." Leslie blinked. "That can't be right." "It is right," the officer snapped. "And you just wasted our time." But Leslie only scoffed. "I know he doesn't belong here," she muttered under her breath, her gaze lingering on Kingston with contempt. Kingston, arms still crossed, simply smiled. He knew this wasn't the end. Leslie seethed as she stomped back to her house, her face burning with humiliation. She had been so sure, so certain, that Kingston didn't belong here. But now, the police had dismissed her, and she had been made to look like a fool in front of the entire neighborhood. That couldn't stand. If she couldn't force Kingston out immediately, she would make his life miserable. The next morning, Kingston stepped outside to grab his mail and noticed Leslie across the street, glaring at him from her porch. He ignored her, but as he turned back toward his house, his phone buzzed with a notification. A local neighborhood group had a new post. "Attention! Suspicious activity reported in our community. Be on the lookout for a new resident exhibiting unusual behavior. If you see something, say something." Kingston shook his head. The post didn't mention him by name, but the message was clear. Leslie was already trying to rally people against him. Things escalated quickly. That same afternoon, he noticed Leslie pacing outside his home, phone in hand, snapping pictures. When his friend Chris came over to help him unpack, Leslie immediately pulled out her phone again, pretending to take note. "What's up with her?" Chris muttered, throwing a glance toward Leslie. "She's looking for a reason to call the cops again," Kingston said, keeping his voice low. As if on cue, Leslie called out, "Excuse me, but what are you two doing?" Kingston turned slowly. "Moving in." Still, she sniffed. I'm just documenting, in case something happens. Kingston bit back his irritation. Something like what? Leslie smiled thinly. Oh, I don't know. You people tend to bring trouble. Chris took a step forward, but Kingston placed a hand on his shoulder. He had a different plan. That night, Kingston did some documenting of his own. He set up a security camera on his front porch and adjusted the angle just right. If Leslie was going to harass him, he'd have evidence. Days passed, and Leslie's antics worsened. Kingston's guests started getting harassed too. When his sister visited, Leslie followed her to her car, peeking inside as if searching for stolen goods. When Kingston ordered a package, Leslie intercepted the delivery man, bombarding him with questions about what Kingston was receiving. But then, she made her biggest mistake. One afternoon, Kingston's doorbell camera recorded Leslie losing her temper at a delivery driver. The young man, who looked barely 20, stood frozen as Leslie screeched at him. I know what you're up to, she spat. Bringing drugs into our neighborhood. Get out of here before I call ICE on you. Kingston watched the footage in disbelief. Did she just? She's done, Chris said, shaking his head. Kingston grinned. He uploaded the video that night. Within hours, it went viral. The world was about to see Leslie for who she really was. Kingston had had enough. The harassment from Leslie was becoming unbearable, and with each new incident, he realized just how far she would go to make his life difficult. But the more he thought about it, the more something gnawed at him. There was something off about Leslie. She was loud, rude, and seemingly untouchable, but Kingston wasn't one to back down, especially not from someone who seemed to think the world revolved around their own version of justice. With the help of his lawyer friend, Malik, Kingston decided to do some digging into Leslie's past. Malik, a seasoned attorney with a keen eye for shady dealings, agreed to help without hesitation. The two of them pored over public records, real estate transactions, and even social media profiles. After weeks of meticulous searching, they found it. Leslie's real name was Lesliana Cortez, a far cry from the Leslie she presented to the world. That wasn't the bombshell. As they dug deeper, they discovered that Lesliana Cortez was an illegal immigrant who had entered the U.S. years ago under fraudulent pretenses. She had never fully established legal residency, and her social security number was fake. What do we have here? Malik said, leaning over Kingston's shoulder as he reviewed an immigration file. Looks like her story doesn't add up. Leslie's path to the United States had been paved with lies. She'd somehow managed to secure a job, a house, and even medical care, all by falsifying documents. The house she owned, her precious estate in the wealthy neighborhood, had been bought using a fake social security number she had fabricated years ago. Her name didn't match the one registered in any government database. Malik let out a sharp breath. This is a mess. It's not just immigration fraud. This goes way beyond that. She's been living a life of deception for years. Kingston's mind raced. The woman who had so arrogantly tried to drive him out of the neighborhood was living a lie. The real kicker? She'd been able to stay in the country all this time by exploiting a broken system, while targeting him for no reason other than his skin color. Kingston's grip on his phone tightened. He'd spent days documenting every nasty thing she'd said or done. Now he had her entire criminal history at his fingertip. He wasn't going to let this go. He grinned, a feeling of satisfaction washing over him. It's time for her to face the music. Once Kingston had the full picture, he knew he couldn't just sit on the information. Leslie had tried to ruin his life with lies and false accusations. Now it was his turn to expose her. But Kingston was smart. He knew that hitting her where it would hurt the most wasn't about confrontation. It was about letting the world find out on its own. Kingston took a calculated approach. He anonymously tipped off the authorities about Leslie's immigration fraud, including all the evidence of her fake social security number, her false identity, and the fraudulent documents she had used to acquire her house. But that was only the beginning. He knew that the real exposure would come when the internet got a hold of it. With Malik's guidance, Kingston posted a series of videos that included clips of Leslie's racist tirades, her behavior toward him, and the evidence of her fraudulent activities. He didn't leave anything out. The video quickly went viral. As the footage spread, the public reaction was swift and unforgiving. The sheer hypocrisy of a woman so eager to judge others when she herself was living under false pretenses made the story irresistible. Social media exploded. Comments flooded in with outrage at Leslie's double life. People shared their disbelief that she could sit in judgment of others while hiding her own criminal actions. The hashtag karma for Leslie trended within hours. Local news picked up the story soon after. The headline read, "Outspoken racist Karen turns out to be an illegal immigrant." Kingston's name was mentioned in the broadcast, his role as the one to uncover the truth only adding to the wave of support for him. "I don't know how she thought she could get away with this," said one local commentator on the news. "She's not just a racist, she's a criminal." Even the HOA, which had initially been hesitant to take sides, couldn't ignore the growing storm. They were horrified when they learned about Leslie's illegal status and her criminal actions. After a few tense meetings, the HOA made an official statement, disowning her completely and cutting ties. They could no longer afford to have her represent their community. Kingston couldn't help but feel a sense of poetic justice as he watched the world turn against Leslie. The woman who had tried to tear him down was now the one exposed for her lies and hate. It was more than just the end of a personal battle, it was a public lesson in humility and justice. Leslie, once so sure she could dominate her surroundings, was now fighting to save face. But there was no saving her reputation, not after everything had been laid bare. As Kingston sipped his coffee that morning, watching the chaos unfold, he finally allowed himself a smile. He had won, not through confrontation, but by letting truth and the public handle the fallout. The scales had tipped, and Leslie's world had come crashing down. The storm Leslie had been running from was finally upon her. Kingston watched as the authorities moved in, step by step, unraveling the web of lies she had spun for so long. The phone call to the immigration office had been the first domino to fall, and now it seemed the whole world was coming to her doorstep. The truth came out faster than anyone expected. Her forged social security number, the fraudulent documents, the fake identity, it all painted a damning picture. Leslie had spent years living in the U.S. without the legal rights to do so, but she hadn't just broken the law, she had flaunted her deception while trying to destroy the lives of others. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, took swift action. They arrived in force, securing Leslie's property and informing her that she would be facing deportation. It was a humiliating blow. The house, the very symbol of her power and privilege in the community, was no longer hers. Without a legal claim, Leslie's once prized home was seized, leaving her with nothing. Her friends were the first to turn their backs on her. The few people who had stuck by her through the initial outbursts and complaints now distanced themselves, fearful of the public backlash. Some of her neighbors, once complicit in her silent campaign of hate, quietly removed themselves from any association with her. They couldn't afford to be linked to someone with such a racist past. Kingston, on the other hand, took it all in with calm satisfaction. As he sat on his porch, sipping his coffee, he watched the chaos unfold. He had fought for his peace and his dignity, and now it was all coming full circle. Leslie, the woman who had called the police on him for simply existing in his own home, was now packing her bags and preparing for the ride of her life, straight out of the country. She passed by Kingston's house, her eyes flicking over toward him as she struggled to load her belongings into a car. Kingston didn't even look up. There was no need to say anything. His presence alone was a reminder of her downfall. Leslie's world had crumbled, and she was now facing the consequences of her actions. The smug confidence she once had was gone, replaced by desperation and shame. She had no one to turn to, and no one was there to defend her. Kingston took another sip of his coffee, savoring the taste. This was more than just a victory, it was redemption. For him, for the neighborhood, and for everyone who had ever been hurt by people like Leslie. He'd won, and the satisfaction of it was sweet. As Leslie's departure grew inevitable, Kingston felt the shift in the atmosphere around him. The neighborhood that had once been divided, tense with the fallout of Leslie's actions, now rallied behind him in full support. They'd watched him endure the brunt of Leslie's cruelty, and now they were determined to make things right. It started with small gestures. Neighbors who had once stayed quiet now approached Kingston with apologies, offering support and asking how they could help. One by one, they came together, forming a tight-knit community that stood for fairness and inclusivity. Kingston had always believed in the power of unity, and now, more than ever, he saw it in action. The HOA, which had remained silent for so long, now saw the error of their ways. The president of the association visited Kingston personally, apologizing for their failure to act sooner. They offered him an official position, a leadership role in the community. "We want to make things right," the president said, a newfound respect in his voice. Kingston hesitated for a moment, then accepted. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for the people who had stood by him when it mattered most. But the most gratifying moment came when Leslie's desperation finally reached Kingston. She, once so confident in her position of power, was now a broken woman. One afternoon, Kingston answered a knock on his door. Standing there, with a defeated look on her face, was Leslie. She was desperate, her eyes wide with panic. I need your help," she stammered. "Please, you have to help me. You can fix this." Kingston stared at her for a long moment, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Finally, he spoke. "I thought I didn't belong here," he said slowly. "But now, it seems you're the one who doesn't." Her face fell, and the tears that had been threatening to spill finally did. She pleaded, begging him to intervene, but Kingston turned his back, closing the door gently behind him. He'd done more than enough. Cameras from news outlets captured Leslie being taken away by ICE officers the next day. She screamed as she was led out of the neighborhood, kicking and flailing, her protests lost in the roar of the crowd that had gathered to witness her downfall. It was a fitting end for a woman who had lived her life trying to tear others down. With Leslie gone, Kingston was finally able to settle into the home he had fought so hard for. It was no longer just a house, it was a symbol of his strength, his resilience, and the justice that had finally caught up with the woman who had tried to break him. He spent his evenings sitting on his porch, the weight of the past finally lifting from his shoulders. Kingston was home, at last, safe, at peace, and more powerful than ever.